The painted wagon was called the bride trailer. It moved slow as a prayer across the desert, its canvas sides brushed with garlands and small white flowers. Inside sat 6 women with dresses hidden under traveling shawls, each clutching a letter from a man they had never met. Wind slid its fingers through the ribbons and rattled the buckles. The road ahead shimmered, and the road behind was already a memory. At the head rode James Callahan, most called him Jim. He wore his hat low and his worry lower. A thin scar traced a line from his temple to his jaw, the mark of a past that refused to stay buried. Once he was a man paid to find men. Now he was a man paid to keep vows alive long enough to be spoken. He rode with the quiet attention of someone who trusted his horse more than his luck. Among the brides sat Margaret Dawson. Folks called her Maggie when they were kind, and Miss Dawson when they wanted to keep their distance. She had neat gloves and a bonnet pulled so the sun would not find her eyes. Those eyes were steady. She watched the land the way a reader studies a letter for words not written. She kept her letter folded, tucked into her bodice. She had read it enough to memorize every comma. The name at the bottom was Victor Harrington, a gentleman by reputation and a businessman by habit. He had asked for her hand, and with it, he had found a way to ask for everything else she possessed. The pass ahead narrowed between red cliffs that leaned toward each other like men whispering secrets. Jim lifted a hand and slowed the train. He listened to the wind. He listened to the hooves. He listened to the silence, because silence has a shape when trouble waits. The hawk above screamed once. The hair on his arms rose. He opened his mouth to call a halt. The first rifle crack split the morning. The wagon jolted. A front wheel shattered and threw splinters that flashed like teeth. Horses screamed. The air filled with dust so thick it turned the sun into a coin held behind dirty glass. Masked riders spilled down the cliff face on wiry ponies, whooping with the hot joy of men who love to scare more than they love to eat. Down. Heads low, Jim shouted. He fired twice and saw 2 riders peel away. A third leaned from his saddle and threw a coil of rope that bit the air like a snake. Inside the wagon, panicked hands clutched at lace and at one another. The canvas roof flapped like a trapped bird. Maggie felt a rough hand seize her arm. She twisted hard, but another hand found her waist. For one instant she caught Jim's gaze through the dust, the scar on his cheek a bright line. She did not scream. She pressed her lips together and threw her elbow where she hoped it would hurt. A laugh answered her. She was dragged over a saddle and carried toward the shadow of the rocks. Jim tried to cut the bandit off, but a second rider shouldered in and forced his horse aside. Smoke and grit stung his eyes. By the time he cleared his view, Maggie was only a pale scrap of skirt disappearing around an outcrop, swallowed by the country the way rain disappears into thirsty ground. Something old and heavy shifted in Jim's chest. Once he had been too late. A boy had swung from a rope because Jim had believed the wrong man. The scar on his face burned as if the memory had teeth. He drew in the dust and swallowed it whole. Then he fought for the wagon until no more bullets rode the air and the riders melted back into the rocks with their prize. By night the air had cooled, but fear kept heat in the world. The brides huddled near a small fire with shawls drawn tight. Mary Ellen Harper, who smelled faintly of flour even after 3 days of travel, pressed her hands together until her knuckles looked like chalk. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "the one they took. Will she be all right?" Jim stood with the firelight cutting his face into angles. He was a large man who seemed to take up less space than he should, as if habit had taught him how to step aside from his own life. "I will bring her back," he said, "even if it costs me my life." The words were not thunder. They were steel. He packed his saddlebags, checked the sights on his rifle, tightened the cinch, and mounted up. The wagon master tried to talk him out of it. The brides clutched at his stirrup. He answered none of it. Promises, he knew, were lighter than air until you tied them to something heavier than yourself. He was done letting other men set the knot. Maggie's wrists were bound with a rope that burned. She sat upright on a blanket by a dead mesquite branch and watched the men who watched her. The camp sat in a narrow throat of canyon with a trickle of water, keeping the dust from settling. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, if you counted the man in the velvet vest who moved like he owned the ground. He crouched in front of her with a smile that did not use his eyes. "Miss Dawson," he said, "your Victor Harrington is a man of taste and generosity. He will pay handsomely for your safe return. He will pay more for the papers you keep so close to your heart. She stared past him. Do you often speak of love with a price list in your pocket? He laughed softly. I speak of business wherever I can. Love is a pretty ribbon. Business ties the bow. She did not let him see her tongue press a sore tooth. In the dim light she studied their boots, their horses, their saddlebags. A limp on one man, a tendency to scratch at his neck on another. Away the velvet one kept glancing down canyon where the shadows were thicker. She counted their canteens. She counted their bullets by the way their belts sagged. Jim tracked them by moon, and by what men always leave behind. Hoofprints on the soft bank of a creek, a small thread of pale ribbon from a torn hem caught in a thorn, the ash from a cigarette that had gone cold an hour earlier. He moved like someone practicing regret into redemption, following the thin music of sign the way a fiddler follows a tune. At the edge of their firelight he slid to his belly and let the dust own him. He saw Maggie where they had set her, rope around her wrists, her chin high as a flag. She lifted her head as if she had heard his breath. Their eyes met. They promised each other the same thing. Hold, wait, trust. When one guard wandered away to take a leak, Jim slipped the knife from his boot. He came up behind her like the dark learned to walk. When I cut, you run east for the creek, he whispered. There are 3 beyond the wagon, she murmured without moving her lips. 1 limps. Their horses are tied low to the brush. He grunted approval and drew the blade up the rope until it sighed. The fibers gave way. For one heartbeat they were still and free and as loud as thunder in their own ears. Then everything happened at once. A shout, the scrape of a boot, a hand reaching and missing. Hooves slamming the ground. They broke for the creek like deer who remember once being horses. Bullets snapped the air behind them like insects too angry to die. The water took them in with a shock that reset the world. They stumbled and waded, and then ran again with their boots squelching like curses. They did not stop until the night made a nest around them beneath cottonwoods whose leaves whispered that fear passes. Jim crouched, listening to the country breathe. Maggie sat with her back to a trunk, hands raw and steady. He said, James Callahan. She said, Margaret Dawson. He said, why were those men talking about paper and price when a bride is supposed to carry a ring? She drew a slow breath that had been waiting to leave her since winter. My father died in January. He left me a claim up in the foothills. The vein is thin but faithful. The water is the real treasure. Victor Harrington wrote to me with sweet words and careful questions. He learned exactly what I had and how alone I might be. If he cannot marry the deed, he will steal it and bury me somewhere nobody looks. Jim nodded once. He had walked the edges of too many schemes not to see the shape of this one. Then we do not go to Harrington, he said. We go to a judge. Rain came in the morning like the sky had been holding its breath for months. It turned the dust to clay and the clay to slick. The trail they chose was a goat's idea of a joke, narrow and stubborn. Jim led his horse on foot and felt the pull of the earth like a cousin's hand you cannot shake. A bullet smacked stone by Maggie's shoulder and started a small rock slide that rattled their nerves louder than their bones. He shoved her beneath an overhang and fired twice to let the world know he still had more to say. She tore a strip from her hem and wrapped his arm where the bullet had drawn blood. Her hands were firm. The closeness was ordinary, and then not. Rain threaded through the air like string and made a curtain where the rest of the world stood on the far side. By night they had put miles behind them, but not enough between them and those who hunted. In the small shelter of a scrub oak he broke open a leather pouch they had stolen in the scramble. Inside lay a folded map with a red wax seal. The seal bore a stamp she knew better than her own handwriting. Victor Harrington. The route traced a line not to Silverton's church with its polite bell and nicer windows, but to a shuttered silver mine 2 valleys over where the earth had already swallowed men who thought they could take more than they gave. He does not want a wedding, Jim said. He wants a ledger change. He wants me to disappear, Maggie said. They rode into Red Bluff the next day with wet hat brims and dry mouths. Red Bluff was a town that tried to pretend it would not take a side if a fistfight broke out, but the truth showed in the tilt of its awnings and the way men watched from doorways. The notice nailed to the post office door said a reward waited for anyone who returned Miss Margaret Dawson to the kind care of Mr. Victor Harrington. The amount was enough to buy a small farm or a large mistake. In the saloon, a woman with smoke-dark eyes played a piano that might have belonged to someone who could afford to tune it. She wore her hair pinned up with a comb that did not match the room, and a dress with a high collar that kept secrets where people expect to show. Her name was Rose Carter. She looked Jim over like the past owed her a drink and tipped her head toward the stairs. "You two look like a story with a price," she said. "You can have the back room if you want to pay for it with truth." Maggie said, "We are looking for a judge, one who still believes law can be more than a man's pocket." Rose's mouth quirked. "Then you need Judge Nathaniel Brooks. He rides circuit with a Bible under one arm and a ledger under the other. He holds court wherever the floor is flat and the roof does not leak too much. He was last seen near the old mine. That is either fate or a trap, maybe both." They slept fitfully, taking turns listening to the house breathe. After midnight, a window latch clicked. Jim's hand moved before the thought formed. He caught a wrist attached to a knife and slammed it against the sill hard enough to make the knife clatter to the floor. The intruder fled, leaving behind a handkerchief embroidered with initials. VH, the perfume smelled expensive and dim. Harrington had long arms and polite manners that did not mind getting dirty in the dark. They returned to the wagon camp at dawn to gather the brides and decide who would push on and who would turn back. Mary Ellen ran to Maggie and peppered her with questions and tears and exclamations, each one punctuated by a sudden hug. Behind her stood Evelyn Porter, a woman with a cool mouth and a neat dress who kept her hair smooth with a care that suggested she wanted life to do likewise. Evelyn brought tea. Steam curled into the morning chill. Maggie lifted the cup and paused. Her tongue tingled. Jim's hand knocked the cup away. It shattered and bled its contents into the dirt. "Who told Harrington where to find us?" Jim asked. His voice turned quiet in the way that makes men back up. Evelyn's chin came up. "He promised me a dress from Paris. He promised a home with curtains and a door with a name. He said Miss Dawson would stand in the way of my chance to be respectable." Her voice did not shake until the last word. "I did a foolish thing for a promise that did not belong to me." Boots clattered and told the rest. Deputies who wore Harrington's favor on their badges spilled into the street with pistols drawn and mouths set hard. Jim did not waste breath on speeches. He shoved the brides behind the wagon and fired until the men wished they had learned to shoot straighter. The river bridge lay ahead with the posse chewing up the ground behind. Mary Ellen threw open the supply crate and dragged out flour sacks with the focus of a woman measuring out a cake recipe during a thunderstorm. "Flour dust goes boom if you give it a spark," she said between breaths. They ripped the sacks and let the dust fan into a white cloud across the planks. Jim tossed a lantern. For a heartbeat, the air turned white in a way that did not belong to this world. Then a deep thump rolled through their bones and the bridge coughed itself to pieces. Riders tumbled into the river like someone had dropped a handful of toys. The brides whooped with the relief of people who had just outrun a bear. Jim did not whoop. He counted cartridges and looked north where the sky lay lower. They found an abandoned mission by nightfall. The roof leaked in 2 places and the altar sat crooked, but the walls felt like they remembered being kind. Candles made the air gold. Jim cleaned his rifle in silence. Maggie rubbed her ankles where river rocks had argued with her bones. "You keep your eyes like a locked door," she said finally. He turned the rifle bolt and did not look up. "I brought in a boy once," he said. 16. He was accused of robbing a postcoach. I brought him in alive because I thought that counted for something. The sheriff wanted his brother, the one who testified. They hanged the boy to make the brother talk. I hunted the wrong man. I have been paying that bill since." Maggie crossed the floor and rested her hand gently against his scar. "Then hunt right now," she said. They let the candle gutter down while the rain softened from insult to apology. The silence did not feel empty. It felt like a thing being mended. Morning brought purpose and the return of Rose Carter with a satchel full of papers. She had a talent for reading dead letters and live men. "Harrington buys sheriffs wholesale," she said, "but a judge is harder to own outright. Brooks will meet you at the mine. If he finds enough daylight and something that looks like evidence, he will make a courtroom out of a rock and a chair." The mine opened its mouth to them late in the afternoon. Lanterns moved in the tunnels like swallowed stars. Men with polished boots guarded the entrance and tried to look like they did not answer to anyone. Gideon Vance, Harrington's partner in silk, waited with a blank marriage ledger as if he believed the world could be bent into whatever shape money liked best. "Miss Dawson," Vance said with a generous smile, "we feared the worst. Mr. Harrington's heart is broken. Sign here, and let us mend what can be mended." Maggie did not touch the book. "You want ink more than vows," she said. "Where is Judge Brooks?" "Right where he needs to be," came a dry voice from the tunnel mouth. Judge Nathaniel Brooks stepped into the fading light with his hat in his hand and his gavel somewhere else entirely. He was a tall man who looked like a fence post that had decided to stand in the wind until the wind understood its mistake. "Let us not waste good daylight on bad manners," the judge said. "We will hold court." They gathered in the open chamber just inside the main shaft where carts and rails and the smell of the earth itself gave everything a gravity words often lack. The bride sat on overturned crates, hands folded tight or picking at skirts. Rose stood near Maggie and had a look on her face that would have been called a smile in a better year. Jim stood behind them with his rifle held low and his attention held high. The judge read aloud the letters that promised one thing and asked another. He looked at the maps that sent a bride to a mine instead of a church. He listened to Maggie with his eyes as well as his ears. "Miss Dawson," he asked, "do you wish to marry Victor Harrington?" "No," she said, and her voice did not wobble. "Then this is not a wedding," Judge Brooks said. "It is theft wearing a flower." The words angered the men who needed them not to matter. Vance lunged. Jim's boots sent Vance's pistol clattering under an ore cart. From the tunnel behind them, a shout grew legs and arrived in a rush of hired riders who found their courage in other men's money. Pistols popped, rifles cracked. The air turned tight and hot. Jim pushed Maggie behind a timber and shot where he saw the gleam of brass. Rose grabbed Mary Ellen and dragged her behind a stack of lumber while cursing like someone who had learned the language for self-defense. Evelyn sobbed and then, as if deciding sin required service, kicked over a lantern on the catwalk above to throw up a wall of flame and smoke between the brides and the men who wanted to call them property. A bell rope hung near the shaft mouth. In a mine it warns and it calls and it tells the mountain to hush. Jim lifted his rifle and took one breath to steady the barrel. He shot the rope where it met the beam. The bell dropped like a verdict, smashing the winch and snarling cables. The floor beneath two gunmen buckled and sent them down in a tangle of curses and iron. The fight staggered and then broke. Men with money in their pockets do not like to bleed. They ran, some tripping over their own haste, some carried by friends whose loyalty would not survive the next sunrise. Smoke ached in everyone's lungs. The judge coughed and waved his hat like a fan. "By authority of the territory and my own stubbornness," he said hoarsely. "Miss Margaret Dawson's claim is affirmed. Her person is her own. Her water and silver are not for sale to men who trade in fear. As for the rest, I will sign warrants when my hand stops shaking." They came out into daylight just as the side tunnel groaned and folded in on itself like a tired man kneeling. Dust lifted in a sigh and fell again like tired snow. Out front, Rose helped bind the hands of those who had not run fast enough. Jim put a hand on Maggie's shoulder and felt the tremble in his own bones more than in hers. Silverton met them with the kind of quiet that sits on a town when the bully runs. Harrington's windows were shuttered. His accounts had been frozen by a banker who had decided to believe in caution for once. Rumor said Harrington left on the early stage with his hat pulled low and his pride even lower. The town remembered how to say no. It remembered how to say welcome to the right people. Rose opened the music hall and took down the boards from the windows. She played with the relieved fury of a woman who still had a piano. Mary Ellen took a lease on the old livery and turned it into a bakery that smelled like mornings when life feels possible. Evelyn swept floors beside her, and sometimes, when shame bit too sharply, Mary Ellen would put a bun in her hand and tell her to eat while it was warm because warm bread is the beginning of forgiveness. Maggie sat with surveyors and with a schoolteacher who knew more about wells than some men know about whiskey. The map of her aquifers unrolled across a table like a gift. She decided there would be water for farms and for gardens, and that no one would be turned away who was willing to put a shoulder to a plow and a hand to a neighbor's door. One evening, Jim waited by the river. The willow leaves clicked like small tongues. His hat lay on a rock. He had discovered that sometimes a man needed his head uncovered to say something that scared him. "I do not have much," he said when Maggie came. "A decent horse, 2 hands, a name I am trying to make worth keeping, and one heart that belongs where you are. Say it plain," she said, smiling because she already knew. "Marry me, not for safety, for joy." "Yes," she said, as if testing the word's weight and finding it exactly right. They painted the bride trailer again. The blossoms on the side were brighter, the wheels were trued. Couples came aboard with little more than hope and climbed down with rings they would play with when nervous, and promises they would polish with use. Judge Brooks traveled with them sometimes, issuing rulings at kitchen tables and blessings at crossroads. Rose played a piano that did not fit on a wagon until somehow it did. Mary Ellen baked pies along the trail with an oven she swore was possessed, and therefore reliable. Their wedding was held on a hill above the town under lanterns hung like captured stars. Faces shone the way faces do when they have seen enough sorrow to know how to hold joy with both hands. The judge kept his words short and his eyes bright. "Do you, Margaret Dawson, choose this man freely?" "I do," Maggie said. "Do you, James Callahan, choose this woman freely?" "I do," Jim said. They kissed and the crowd cheered and the harmonica started a tune that did not care if feet stepped wrong. They danced and laughed and stepped wrong together until stepping wrong became the right way when a person you love is holding your hand. Later, when the lanterns had burned low and the night decided it had been patient enough, Jim stood a little apart and looked up at a sky so wide it made a man understand his place. He whispered the boy's name he had not saved. He did not ask for pardon. He promised usefulness. Maggie came beside him and slid her hand into his. "The past does not need a grave," she said. "It needs a job." "Bossy," he said, and the words sounded like relief. "Married," she said, and the words sounded like home. Seasons turned in a way that reminded everyone the earth keeps its own calendar. The bride trailer rolled where it was needed, into towns that had forgotten how to celebrate, and out again, leaving laughter tied to porch rails like ribbons. Sometimes they passed the old mine. Wildflowers had sewn themselves into the scar and made a kind of apology on the mountain's behalf. The fallen bell sat in the town square now, a reminder to warn and to gather and to answer. Children climbed it in the afternoons and shouted down its throat to hear their own voices turned into history. People sometimes asked Jim how he had known where to find Maggie in the dark. He would shrug and say he followed sign and luck, but at night, in the small quiet between breaths, he knew he had followed something else. He had followed the shape a promise makes in a man, when the weight of failure finally becomes the weight of duty. People sometimes asked Maggie why she had not simply run far away and let the claim go to someone else. She would laugh and say, "Water belongs where it can do the most good, and besides, some things are yours because you choose them, not because someone left them in a will." They rode ahead or behind or side by side according to the day. Sometimes they argued like rain and wind argue over who first touched the prairie. Sometimes they were quiet as a church in the hour between services. They chose each other each morning as if remembering is a better verb than believing. If you ever see a painted wagon roll past with blossoms along its boards and a piano somehow making sense where it should not, you will know some promises travel better than most, and somewhere inside, a man with a scar and a woman with steady eyes will be making a life out of second chances and first choices, mile after mile, until the road itself feels blessed to carry them.